Welcome back to the Dungeon Master's Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God, killing characters, and lowering the egos of all other people at the table. I'm one of your hosts, Dungeon Master Mitch.
And I'm your other host, Dungeon Master Neal, aka Joke Maniac.
Today we have a great episode lined up. We are talking about campaign-long dungeons. Dungeons that are big enough to encompass an entire campaign. I know, Neal, this is something that you are quite familiar with as you have been running a campaign-long dungeon for over a year now?
Mm-hmm, definitely.
Which one is it again that you are running?
The Emerald Spire Super Dungeon from Paizo with 16 levels and 16 different authors. So it is pretty different every level that they get into.
It is a mega dungeon. To help us discuss this idea and how, as Dungeon Masters, we can make these dungeons engaging to our players, we have none other than Mike Mearls joining us, the lead designer for Dungeons & Dragons. So we've got a great interview with him coming up. Stay tuned for that. But before we get into the meat, Neal, we have some 5-star reviews.
So the first one we have is from Zargo Games, and it is, of course, 5 stars, entitled The Best Audio Source for Dungeon Master Learning. I found this podcast about a year ago, when I was starting to really dig into dungeon mastering for 5th edition. While it is a system-agnostic podcast, their advice for DMing is invaluable and has inspired a lot of my creations and led me to think of things differently, for the better. That's good. I like that there's that caveat. If you're a dungeon master, this podcast is a must-listen. Also, someone found this to be a helpful review, so there you go. And I hope it helped you. So, thank you, Zargo Games. I know you're following us on Twitter. I've seen you.
Our next one comes from Gallican. Hey, we might hear from him later on in the episode. And it is entitled, Get Ready to Roll 20 on Intelligence Checks. Gallican says, been listening to you guys for a long time and finally manned up and got on iTunes to leave you guys a review. Yes, thank you, Gallican. If you listeners need help getting your stories going, look no further. The folks on this podcast have got you covered. As someone who loves to DM, there was a lot on here that I didn't even realize I was doing and that needed some adjustment. You guys helped me clean up my games tremendously and also helped me point my newbie DM friends to a place where they could get some fantastic third-party help. Keep it up, guys. Hashtag Blockheads Unite. Yes. Thank you, Gallican, for that awesome review. Yes, let's see that hashtag become a viral sensation over the next couple weeks. Hashtag Blockheads Unite.
Yes. But with that, let's head to the meat.
I'm starving. We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.
Why can't we have some meats?
The flat meat's back on the menu, boys.
Well, welcome to the meat. Today we have none other than Mike Mearls, lead designer of Dungeons & Dragons at Wizards of the Coast, with us. Mike, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you on our show.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, of course. Before we jump into the meat and the discussion that we're here to have, which is campaign-long dungeons, we, as we do with all of our guests, have a couple interview questions, and we want to just kick it off with just that simple question of, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So, as mentioned in the intro, I'm the lead designer on D&D. My official job title is something like senior manager of design and development or something like that. But basically what I do at work is coordinate the creative team on D&D. We create the ongoing storylines. Every year we do a new story. So I organize that creation. It's actually Chris Perkins who does the actual writing and game design, but I more lead things in terms of coordinating everything that's happening, leading the writer's room, things like that, getting the creative stuff going, and also do a lot of coordination between what we're doing with D&D, the role-playing game, and D&D in video games and other licensed games. Kind of figuring out how do all the stories tie together, and how do we create things so that they have the most use both for dungeon masters and for people who are making D&D licensed games. One of the things that it's most enjoyable part of my job is we'll go back into D&D lore and take monsters or take characters and locations and sort of not necessarily try to change them, but sort of update them. Like, what can we do to like make them more interesting for a modern gaming audience? So in a lot of ways, my job would be sort of picking, here's what we're going to focus on, and then I unleash the really talented writers and game designers we have here to implement those concepts.
Yeah, I know with Volos, that was just such a cool thing to get a different take on a monsters manual that just really dived into the lore. I really like that deeper intake to the lore, and I'm excited just to see, and I know you know what's coming down the line for a couple of years now, but you won't tell us. But I'm excited to see what Wizards releases with a deeper look into all that rich lore that we've seen over the years, and having kind of bringing that lore together too with all the edition releases and different settings. It's interesting stuff.
Yeah, I'm glad you like Volos, and I'm really excited. It's done very well for us. Both, people, a lot of people are buying it, which is always nice. But it's nice to see it get good reviews, because that was kind of like a test of, will this new approach sort of, it's not really a new approach. It's more transitioning to an approach we've used in the past. And it's been great to see it really resonate with people. And so, because for me, I have to admit, developing monsters is the most enjoyable part of my job.
Yeah,
I love
that's your favorite.
Working on creatures. Yeah, that is the best, like, writer's room of memories I have are when we're like working through a list of monsters, and the challenge is always just like, how do you let's take what we've said about this monster, and let's build on it to make something that's it's very distinct. When you have a creature that on the surface, you could say, oh, this creature's a guardian of nature, but then you're like, well, why isn't that just a treant? Treants are kind of that role too. So what we'll do is, really try to find something distinct, and often it's taking what exists about the creature and turning it up. So yesterday, we had a meeting. We were talking about the Grey Render. If you remember the Grey Render from 3rd and 4th edition, it's this really big hulking monster. And its interesting piece of lore is that it can like sort of imprint on someone and follow them around. And so one of the things I like doing, and this is, I don't know if we'll actually publish this, but this is one of the ideas we had was, well, what if this creature, it's this big, huge, powerful creature, it imprints on you, so it follows you around like a puppy dog. But because it's this big, monstrous creature, like, what if it actually is more trouble than it's worth? Like, when you meet the orcs, like, it beats up the orcs for you. You're like, oh, great, this thing's awesome. This Grey Render's our friend. It just kicked the crap out of all these orcs. And then you're traveling on, and you come across the dwarven caravan, and it kicks the crap out of the dwarves in the caravan because it wants to protect you. You're like, no, don't do that. Bad Grey Render, right? Like, things like that. You're like, what can we do to make these things more distinct so it's not, and to throw curveballs at the players, right? So it's not just, oh, the Grey Render is friendly. It's like, no, it's protective, and it doesn't always understand because its intelligence is 3. It doesn't really understand the difference between the dwarves who are approaching you to talk or to trade, and the orcs that are charging at you to fight you. And it's about how can you make those story moments really come to life, or give a dungeon master like a fiendish new tool to throw at the players. Yeah,
in there lies a lot of great role-playing opportunities with that creature, and exactly.
Yeah, I get to ask the second question, the one that you could definitely have a ton of answers or potentially no answers. Is there anything you are currently working on right now? And I will add the necessary caveat of that you can tell us.
Well, I appreciate the caveat.
No problem.
So I will start by something I can definitely talk about. Like, we just shipped Tales to the Yawning Portal. That's a collection of 7 classic dungeons. So really excited about that, and I'm really happy to see people excited about it. Like, whenever one of our philosophies is when we do products, we're trying to do things that you haven't seen before as a D&D fan. Which is, on one hand, it's fun because we get to try to do new things, but on the other hand, it's like nerve-wracking because like that new thing, it may have been never done before for a reason because nobody wants it. But it's been good to see people, especially we have a lot of people coming into D&D who are new to the game. So an adventure like Forge of Fury, which came out for 3.0 when it first launched, that was 17 years ago. So for me, I'm in my 40s. 17 years ago feels like, oh, that was like last month, right? But for someone who's in high school, like they weren't even maybe not even born yet when Forge of Fury came out. So an adventure to me that's like, oh, that's a classic adventure. I've run it like multiple times. Someone who's in high school today playing D&D, they probably have never seen this adventure before. So it's been cool to see that was kind of the thinking behind it, and that seems to be how it's playing out. That both people have been playing D&D for a long time, they get these adventures updated. It's at least hopefully at least one or not more they've run and remember fondly. And for all our new players coming in, this is kind of like imagine it's almost like if you have a band like Led Zeppelin or something like that, and someone's they're 15 years old, they just discovered them. Okay, what's the first album you give them, right? Like, you don't give them the last Led Zeppelin, you don't give them Coda, you give them Led Zeppelin 4, right? Or,
Yeah.
if that, hey, this is the classic one. This is where you should start. And then eventually, if you're like me when I was in high school, I discovered Led Zeppelin. Eventually you buy all the albums. But, that's kind of like your first starting point. So in terms of working on now, I can't really talk about products, but one of the things we are doing, and I mentioned this, talk about the gray renders example, what we kind of do on a constant basis is go through, pieces of D&D lore. We have essentially a writer's room we set up. We meet like an hour or two a day, and we just crank through concepts. And sometimes we're doing that because we're like, hey, we have this really specific need. Like, we might have like a licensed video game someone's working on, and like, hey, we need some more undead monsters. Like, we want to send the players to the Shadowfell, and there aren't enough really monsters in the monster manual to support that. Or it might be a role-playing game project we're working on, where we're like, oh, let's do another monster book or something like that. So, like, right now we're working on some new monsters for a few various different reasons. I can't say why, but, it's for different projects we're working on and different licensed games. But that's really what most of my day has been. We also have the Unearthed Arcana series, which was weekly. We're throwing out lots of new mechanics, people to play with. And right now we have we have feedback on almost everything. And we've been going through and looking at the feedback, seeing stuff that's scoring high, seeing stuff that's scoring low, trying to get into like why things are scoring high or low, and then kind of assessing now what the next step might look like for all that material. So that's kind of where we are right now. A lot of it is, obviously we have products coming out I can't talk about, but, at this time of year, a lot of it is there's usually like specific story holes we need to fill for different partners or for our own future stuff. So we're kind of like always creating new things or looking, pulling stuff out of the vault and sort of dusting it off, maybe doing new art for it, concept art, and then kind of like, projects like UA right now we're sort of at the stage of like assessing like what that next step might look like. So
You had me at we're thinking about concepts and working on monsters, because I'll buy a book even if it's a adventure module just for the couple monsters at the end that are new.
Awesome. See, that is so good because I love making monsters. It's the most
and that's
best part
the
of the
thing.
job.
I'm like, so you're having a great time right now if that's what you're working on currently, because you just said how much you love making monsters.
Oh yeah.
All right, Mike, we have one more question for you. This one you had no idea what it was. You did know a surprise question was coming.
It's the ambush.
That's the ambush question. This one's from one of our Patreon members, our Silver Dragon Patreon. Gallican asks this question to you. He says, Do you have a particular NPC voice that when you're dungeon mastering you love to use, that it's your favorite? And if so, can you please demonstrate?
Oh, a favorite one. Wow, that is... I do a lot of voices, some poorly, some badly. The worst, and I'm gonna stall a bit, so I'm gonna try to think of an example. Okay. My most awkward moment, like... I sometimes, like a lot of Americans, when I think old time fantasy, I default to like a bad British accent. Yes. And there was one time I was running a table at a convention, and it turned out like these 5 people sat down, and they were all British, like they were like students or something like that. This is like back in Connecticut. Oh, it's like I can't, and I almost started doing the accent. Fantastic. Like, no, I can't do it. Oh, I got it. Like a fawning merchant who's like, oh yes, whatever you need, right away, chop, whatever. Like, and like, but he's always like a total, like he's the guy who just tried to get the characters killed. So a lot of it's context, like, the players hear like, oh, this pirate captain just sent assassins to kill us. We killed the assassins. They confront him, and he's like this halfling, like, oh yes, mighty masters, what is it that you wish? Captain Strong said, we'll see to it that the wonders of the far west are laid bare before you, and that any treasures you seek shall be yours. Yeah, and then you get for me the punchline is this is the guy they know is this total jerk, powerful, just tried to kill them, and he's this total like weaselly, like, oh please, merchant.
Can't trust them at all. Yep.
That's awesome.
So yeah, that's like the last one I think that ever stuck in my mind.
There's always like the classic, like, hello, I am the big, strong kind of guy, but I'm kind of nice sounding. It's just like, I am the big, strong, powerful, angry guy. That kind of voice.
How would a ogre sound if you were role playing an ogre? Let's hear the Mike Mearls ogre.
Ogre. So if it's an ogre, smash. But then there's also like the dopey from the. Yes, master. What is your bidding? Right, and bidding is like the most complex guy.
We had to get some monsters out of you. Like Mike's sitting there thinking how these monsters sound all the time.
No, we do. Right? And then, so if it's something like I would do like a kobold might be like this. Yes, we are just the followers of the worm. It is he who we worship.
We brook no violence in our lair. Cross not the dragon lords, then lest thy wishes to feel their fury.
So that's another one. And you get to see me hunch over like a little kobold. So, but that's the fun of being a dungeon master, right?
Oh yeah, and you know what, Gallican, you have been severely rewarded because you just got more than one voice. But the unfortunate thing for you guys as listeners is that only me and Neil were able to see Mike as he was fully into it, like you just said, hunched over and just like completely acting. But Mike, thank you so much. That was a great answer.
That was awesome.
Awesome, thank you. That was a lot of fun.
Or answers, I should say.
Yeah,
and thank you, Gallican, for that question. Yeah. So let's talk about what we came to talk about here today. Campaign-long dungeons. We're talking about dungeons that the entire campaign is all about getting through it, getting to the center of the dungeon, wherever it is that you're trying to get to for whatever it is reason that you're trying to complete this dungeon. And so one of the first things that I want to talk about, and Mike, we really want to hear what you think about this because I mean, Tales of the Yawning Portal just came out. It is a book full of dungeons, some newer, some older, like you were saying, that people have played in for years. But you guys have just focused a lot on these huge dungeons. And so this whole idea of a dungeon that is big enough to have a whole entire campaign, and like that's a huge dungeon. How do you make a dungeon that is, one, big enough to encompass a whole campaign? But maybe even the more important question is, how do you make a dungeon engaging enough to encompass a whole campaign? I think that's probably the harder one, that it's not just door after room with creature after creature, but making it a world in itself.
Yeah, and I have to admit, like, this is something that I've tried a few times in campaigns, and I have yet to make it quite work the way I want it to. Typically what I find is, so using my current campaign as example, one of the things that you get when you're not using a big dungeon, and I'll kind of start there, because my current campaign is working pretty well because the players get to go to a lot of very different locations, or they get to kind of go off on quests like that take them to places where they like, hey, we really want to go to this location. So my campaign is based in a city, like a lot of campaigns are, and the typical, typically what happens is the players either hear about an enemy they want to go knock off, or I'll use an example. They killed a Hydra, and an alchemist in town told them, hey, if you trade me the Hydra blood, if you give me the Hydra blood and bring me the fur of this legendary Yeti, I'll make for you a magic item. So the player's, great, we want to go kill this Yeti, we'll do the research, we'll go talk to people, we're going to go to the far north, hunt down this Yeti, and that was like an entire 2 or 3 session adventure. The trick there is you have a wide space to play in, so players can go off in lots of different directions. On one hand, that's really, you could say that's overwhelming, because as a DM, you have to be ready for anything. On the other hand, it means as a DM you have a lot of variety. You can, like, okay, this week, I'll just narrate, you spend 2 months journeying to the north, and now you're in the far north, tundra adventure time. And then, like, right now my players are in a city that's sunken, it's like Atlantis, it's the bottom of the ocean, so now they're underwater, things like that. In a dungeon, you just have those passages, right? And it's very easy to feel like it's very claustrophobic. And I've actually found that when I was, the last time I tried building a really big dungeon, it felt like way more prep than the campaign where, my current campaign where the players are shooting off in different directions. Because in some ways, when you see exactly what all your options are in terms of travel, you always worry, like, well, what's the greatest distance the players can go in any straight line for 4 hours of your session? Well, you need to know where all that is. Where in a lot of cases in the, for the campaign I'm running now, since it's a little more episodic, the player, okay, we want to go to the far north. Okay, great. I'm going to spend this week prepping. Okay, here's the little town that's like the port, and then here's this like ruined monastery, then here's where this legendary Yeti lives, then here's these Fae guys who oversee it, and then I'm going to make up a table of just random like things like a snowstorm or marauding, orcs that might come through the area, and then I'm ready to go. And the thing is, as the players do random stuff, the game's more fluid, and I can easily pivot from one thing to the next. Where with the dungeon, like, I just have the map, and if the players come to an edge of the map where they're not sure, like, if I haven't prepped it, I feel a lot more like I have an empty room staring at me, instead of just being able to go, well, I can just roll on this table and see, because the thing with the dungeon is that remains in place. It's a physical location. In the far north venture I use an example, I can roll on my table and go, okay, a giant blizzard hits, and it's driven by these 3 air elementals. Once that's done, that's gone. I don't have to account for it in my campaign anymore. That storm happened, the players deal with it, it breaks up. But that room in the dungeon is still there. The players might want to go back to it. And so that's why I kind of found conceptually is what made it difficult for me. And I'm still working through. So I've tried this a few times. I've run the original Temple of Elemental Evil, and I've actually had a lot of success with that. I know a lot of people online aren't crazy about that adventure, but I actually like that it has these different factions and the different elemental temples sort of vying against each other. And I've always had a lot of success like getting the players to get involved with the temples, turning them against each other. I've also really lucky my players they're not really just kick in the door and fight stuff types of people. My past few groups have been more like, hey, let's disguise ourselves as cultists. Let's like pretend we're coming into the dungeon to join this cult, things like that. So it's not just to them this tactical like SWAT team room to room. Because that's probably more where my playstyle rests, where I like the more role-playing and like what's the creative approach to solving the problem rather than combat. But yeah, I have yet to really do it in a way that's satisfying. Now I'm tinkering with something now where I don't know if you've ever played some of the classic computer games from the 80s. There's one, Wizardry. It was kind of one of the first PC, Apple II games that had like you made up characters, created a party, and went into a dungeon. There was actually an anime in Japan based on the game, and the idea kind of is you have this dungeon, and at the bottom of the dungeon is this guy who like this awful criminal, like he stole some artifact and he fled into the dungeon. So you have all these adventurers going into the dungeon trying to track this guy down. And I thought I'd maybe doing something with that, where the dungeon's purpose it's this hostile environment, and you have a very specific task, long-term task of find this person and get the artifact from them. But then the other adventuring parties kind of come into play, and then the dungeon itself can be really random because it's not like you have all these people going through it and it's this magical place. So, but yeah, I don't think I've run one yet that I've really been satisfied with. Other than Elemental Evil, which I've had success with running that I think 3 times now in my dungeon mastering career.
And I wonder if part of that is because, and I think that a lot of our listeners would relate to exactly what you just said of like you were like, oh, the way that I like to play is by focusing a lot on like the role-playing aspect of it. A lot of our listeners are dungeon masters who are very, very intent about, we love storytelling. That's like their main goal, and I think a lot of them have either players that are like that or are at the very least trying to help their players be more like that, because in the end, if you do have a bunch of players that are the kick in the door and just fight, and that is exactly the way that their players like to play, I would almost say that building a campaign-long dungeon for that kind of play group is a lot easier, because it can be just a lot more simple of just like, well, why not just have tons of encounters? My players love the encounters, so I'll throw in a couple other things in between to make it not just room after room after room of encounters. But for a group that is more focused on role-playing, they're not going to want to have just constantly battling in a dungeon, or at the very least, they're going to want battles to have more than just a roll to see if you hit or miss aspect, and there to be some sort of strategic formulation or just some sort of storytelling in combat as well. And that therein lies where I think it becomes a little bit more difficult, is making there be a consistent role-playing aspect in a dungeon.
Yeah. No, and I think we saw that, let's see, last year at Origins, we did a workshop on dungeon creation. And at one point in the workshop, like every group, every table, we had these tables set up with people at them. Each table created a dungeon encounter. And it was interesting how every group made something that was really driven by role-playing or a puzzle. No one created like, here's the tactical challenge. I just thought that was really interesting, because a lot of times you think dungeon, you think, oh yeah, it's like you talked about, it's room to room tactical
dungeon
fighting.
Crawl, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And like one of the ones that stood out, like there was one group that came up with this idea that you come into this room, and it was a room that had a trap in it, but this fire giant has triggered the trap, and he's trapped in it. But he also has the treasure that the trap was guarding with him, because the idea is like you go to get the treasure, you grab it, this trap goes off. So it's like, how do you deal with this? Like, there's this guy. Do you want the treasure? You're talking to the giant, and oh yeah, that's great. And that to me, it's that kind of thing. I think makes dungeons a lot more interesting. But then I go back to, for me, that issue I have of, okay, I have this interesting role playing encounter, but then right down the hallway, what's there, and how do these things all like the interconnections are so much more obvious. And I think there's actually a lot more to track when you're running a big dungeon than when you're running something that's more episodic, where like things carry over from session to session only if they're important. In the dungeon, like everything carries over. right? You have to answer like, well, what's in this room now, if anything, you know?
You have that mentality that's been produced because of older Dungeons and Dragons players and then newer video game players where it's like, we can't leave the room alone. There's something in the room. Like,
Yeah.
it just is what it is. Like, there's no way that's an empty room. And if we leave it, was it the key that we needed on the next level? Was it the map that we could find? Is it the NPC we should know? It's just like, there's this mentality in the back of everyone's mind that if there's a room, I have to go in it.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I don't trust my dungeon master. They'll put something in there that will come up behind us when we leave.
So going with this, I think that like definitely it is a difficult thing if you have players that are more focused on role playing. And maybe that's the difficulty in like we as dungeon masters, if we are focused more on role playing, if we have players who are, this can be a big challenge, is making a dungeon, if you want to make a ginormous dungeon, something that is engaging to a role-playing style group. Neal, I know that you have been for over a year now, correct? Running a huge dungeon for your group. And so, I mean, what do you guys, if there's any advice that you guys would give, or maybe even advice of things not to do for that style of group to make that dungeon engaging? What are some things that, and maybe we've never done it perfectly, but what would you say to dungeon masters out there? How do you make a giant dungeon engaging?
Well, I know for me, and I've tried to focus on it more lately because I think those early levels, it's difficult to kind of really figure out what people want their players to be. But now that we're kind of in the 5 to 6, 5, 7 range, then I think they understand who they want to be, and I can start integrating their background more into the dungeon. In a lot of ways, the dungeon just is the dungeon, and that tactical element is just going to exist. They're going to have to get through it because it's just there. But flavoring in things like that, and then digging deeper into some of the really weird, interesting NPC connections that they've created is another thing. So essentially building that tactical frame and then putting story elements inside of it. And there are like a rough through line through the whole thing, which I think is also important. I mean, if it's just level 2 and it was only ever level 2, I think you'll lose a little bit. If there's no continuation of the story, it is literally just level 2, level 3, level 4. I think that can get old for the players. Every time they defeat a level, I also have them spend time not being in the dungeon.
Cool.
Going back to town
or even not that anymore, because they've of course, we heard when we talked about building bases, they took over one of the levels of the dungeon because of course they did. That's what players do. Cool. But the last downtime session they actually had just got done taking it over and invited NPCs from town to come like have a housewarming party. And of course I attacked them in the middle of the party. But and that even made the NPC connections richer, and just figuring out, okay, so what does it mean to defend our base? That means we should strengthen this, strengthen that, spend money here, spend money there. But every single time that they're out, I have something else happen. And sometimes if someone's up for it, I have someone else run a session so I get a break.
Cool.
Mike, you talked about making a dungeon and not thinking of it as like too often, especially if it's something that we're not 100% have mapped out and have prepared for. You put it down and it's like, oh, it's a empty room with a couple monsters in the middle. And I haven't thought much more beyond that. But I think too often when we think dungeons as dungeon masters, we do think about that classic, all right, I've got the dungeon map in front of me. It's these square rooms, and like you go from this room to this room, and you almost in your head just kind of have the same stone wall, like couple torches in our head idea of what a dungeon is. And I think that's something, if we want to make engaging dungeons, we need to move away from. Maybe that's how the dungeon starts, but you can have dungeons in ice caverns. You can have it inside of volcanoes. You can, and I mentioned this early on, but like Dead and Thay, when I look at that map, I see a ton of different types of terrains, a ton of different types of environments. And if you're making a giant dungeon and you're just saying it is all stone walls, torches on the walls, like barrels in the corner, like you want to get more into describing and coming up with reasons why even if you want to get into the mechanical reasons of different ways that a different area of a dungeon is going to affect your player groups.
Yeah, I think playing with the environments is a really good way, especially within a dungeon itself. If that's really what Dead and Fae, where I think it really works, is each section of the dungeon feels very distinct. So you feel like you're making some real progress, and it also provides a lot of that variety. Because I think that's the key, right, is to make it so that you feel like there's a progression in what you're seeing, and you really do want to go around the corner or down the stairs to the next level because you want to see what's going to come next. It's just not the same thing over and over again. Another trick I like doing too is kind of take that same thing of like, you're varying your terrain, and then really like we'll vary the relationship of like what's going on in the dungeon. So for instance, I ran a dungeon where the sort of big bad guy had just been killed. Like the sort of person, the boss of the dungeon it was a wizard. He did this experiment. It went horribly wrong. He's dead. And now all the monsters, it's like a civil war. They're all fighting for control of his treasure. So when the players come into that situation, it's a much different thing than like, it's the evil guy at the bottom of the dungeon. He's sending his minions up against us. It's like, no, everyone's, fighting against each other. And some of the groups are like, it's the cooks and the waitstaff, like, the servants, they just want to get out alive, right? Like things like that. And then it's like, the orcs who are just mercenaries who just want to get paid. So they're working for like, the ogre mage because he's paying them now. But can the players, turn them against each other, things like that. Here's the area of the dungeon where these people just want to be left alone. It's like the apprentice wizard who's like this sort of like eccentric, I'm working on inventing a new type of potion. I don't care. I'm just going to barricade myself in here. Just leave me alone, things like that. So you get more of that cast of characters coming to the forefront.
So we're talking about giant dungeons. We're talking about huge dungeons for a campaign. I think along with that, beyond just the regular idea of regular dungeons of, there's going to be monsters in it, with a dungeon of that size, there comes along maybe some different dangers for a campaign-long dungeon. What are those dangers that you can have your players encounter with a dungeon of such a great size?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is always interesting to me about the giant dungeon is the idea that since it is an enclosed environment, the players can watch it evolve. Like you can have the thing where the players think they know how the dungeon works, and then the drow tunnel up into the dungeon from below, and now suddenly this area that they thought they had cleared is filled with a new threat. Yes. Or, creatures that were once friendly are now turning against them, things like that. Because that is the one strength of, you got this map, it's a finite space, so what becomes interesting is when things change, those are much more apparent and I think a lot more interesting to the players. And I think it's also key to keep that element of surprise. So it isn't just, we've been through this area of the dungeon, or we know the green dragon lives on level 5, so we just don't go there. What happens if the green dragon starts wandering around the dungeon, right? Like, it's, things like that.
Well, yeah, now it doesn't have to fight anybody. It's like, hey, look at all this free range. Yeah. Free range.
Yeah, exactly, right? You might start getting ambitions, right? And then I always like, a dungeon for me is a good excuse for fun traps. I love those Indiana Jones style trap things. They also come with a great story, explanation of like, hey, why is this area of the dungeon totally undisturbed for us to go through? Well, there's all these traps that were guarding it that no one else was able to figure out how to overcome. So when the characters get through it, then you get to have like the ancient tomb or whatever, or the undead that have been undisturbed for 100 years, things like that. And I always like that feeling of like discovering, like the dusty, sarcophagus. Like you're the first person to touch this since it was sealed shut 500 years ago. Like what horrors are in it, things like that. That sort of sense of like, the mysterious and the unknown, I think that's always really fun to play with in a big dungeon. That dusty forgotten chamber, or that secret door that no one's found and you're the first ones to open it, like, because then you get to bring in like the old, like really like weird and out there monsters that you otherwise might not normally use. Like the gelatinous cubes, great example, right? It wouldn't work anywhere else except in a dungeon with 10-foot by 10-foot corridors, right?
And you drop it from above.
Yep.
You have a pit trap that they fall into, and then the gelatinous cube slides out of the ceiling because the third dimension is the scariest thing for players.
Exactly. Yes, I like how you think. That is awesome.
I think probably one of the biggest threats is kind of, I know, Neil, you were saying, I take my adventurers back into town every now and then. Mm-hmm. But that danger is once you leave, like you said, Mike, like who's to say that in a realistic world, in a realistic dungeon, that area is not going to fill back up again and be even more of a problem at that point. And what if you can't even escape? What if part of the trap was the door closed behind you and now you're stuck in this giant dungeon with seemingly no way out? Like that in itself makes a huge and scary danger. So I hope that you've enjoyed our discussion with having Mike here talking about dungeons and the dangers of these giant dungeons and maybe giving some inspiration how to make these giant dungeons engaging for your world. Mike, if our listeners would like to reach out, maybe they have a question for you regarding dungeons, maybe specifically even about Yawning Portal, where can they reach you at?
Sure. The best place to reach me is on Twitter. My username there is Mike Mearls. It's all one word, no spaces. And I try to be good about answering questions, though lately I've been kind of busy and I've been kind of letting that pile up a little bit. So
he doesn't answer because he doesn't love you. He answers because he is busy making great content for Dungeons and Dragons. Thank you so much, Mike, for joining us on the show.
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
We hope to have you back sometime in the future.
Yeah, that'd be great. I had a great time. Thanks for having me. Thanks for taking the time to record the show and have me on.
If you'd like to get in touch with us and you can't be restricted by 140 characters, you can always email us at dungeonmasterblock@gmail.com. And if you want to show some extra love and get your review read on air, you can head over to iTunes and give us a 5-star review, which, like I said, we will read on a later episode.
You can follow us on Twitter at DMS_block. That's DMs block. And you can like our Facebook page. Both of those places are great places to go if you want updates about the show, D&D memes, polls, all that crazy goodness. We have a Patreon member shout-out of the week, and this week's Patreon member shout-out goes to Bonnie Bogaziski.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. Bonnie is a bronze dragon, so Neal, Bonnie gets to listen to any of our bonus content. Thank you so much. We appreciate that support.
As always, the Dungeon Masters Block is a proud member of the Block Party Podcast Network, where you can check out other shows like the GM Showcase, Geek Wars, We're So Bad Adventuring, and more to come.
And that's it for this episode of the Dungeon Masters Block, the place where you come to hear about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God,
Killing characters,
and lowering the egos of all the people at the table. Neal, have your child say goodbye.
Can you say keep on dungeon mastering?
Yeah.
Oh, can you say goodnight?
No.
Okay. Good night and good luck.
Keep on dungeon mastering.
Good job.
That's staying in there for sure.
Goodbye.